Hey guys, welcome back to the Sleep Atlas. Tonight, we're diving into a story that's equal parts philosophy, conspiracy theory, bedtime myth, and pop culture fuel. It's a tale you've probably heard whispered at some point, maybe in a high school classroom, maybe in a late-night documentary with overdramatic music, maybe in a YouTube rabbit hole that started with ancient history and ended with aliens built the pyramids. I'm talking, of course, about Atlantis. Now, Atlantis isn't just a myth. It's the myth, the Beyoncé of lost civilizations. Everyone has heard of it. Everyone has an opinion about it. And almost no one has actually read the original text where the whole thing starts. Spoiler alert, the entire legend of Atlantis comes from one guy, a single philosopher, Plato. That's it. No mysterious scrolls, no carved stone tablets buried under the sea, no secret Atlantean GPS coordinates. Just Plato sitting in Athens around 360 BCE telling a story. But here's where it gets interesting. Plato didn't present Atlantis as an adventure story or even as history. He meant it as a kind of philosophical parable, an allegory about ideal societies, corruption, and hubris. In other words, he wasn't trying to pitch a Netflix original about an island sinking beneath the waves. He was making a point about politics, virtue, and why Athens was the best city ever. However, and here's the twist, Atlantis was simply too juicy to stay trapped in philosophy. Over time, it mutated. What started as Plato's lecture note became a legend. Then a legend became a mystery. Then a mystery became a conspiracy. And today, Atlantis is a whole cottage industry. Books, movies, games, podcasts, even tourist resorts that borrow the name. All because of one story told over 2,000 years ago. So tonight we're going to wander through that story. Slowly, calmly, like walking barefoot through sand at low tide. We'll start where it began, with Plato himself and the story he told in Timaeus and Critias. We'll drift through the description of this perfect civilization, shining and abundant, until it began to decay under its own arrogance. We'll follow its cataclysmic end in one day and one night of misfortune. And then, because no myth is ever left alone, we'll trace the afterlife of Atlantis through Renaissance scholars, Victorian mystics, sci-fi writers, and internet theorists with way too much free time. Along the way, we'll pause, lean back, and notice how the myth says more about us than it ever did about some lost island. Because that's the real power of Atlantis. It's not about whether it existed. It's about why we can't stop dreaming it did. Before we jump in, though, let me ask you, what's keeping you up tonight? Is it work, stress, some nagging thought you can't quite shake? Let me know in the comments. I always love hearing from you guys. And if you're listening while drifting off, go ahead and dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft white noise. We're going to sink into this story together. And who knows? You might drift into your own dream of Atlantis before we even reach the first chapter. All right, let's start where all great myths do, at the beginning. Chapter 1. The First Whisper of a Lost World. Picture Athens in the 4th century BCE. The air is thick with dust, debate, and the clatter of sandals on stone. This is Plato's city, a place where philosophers gathered in courtyards, scribes scratched notes onto wax tablets, and everyone who mattered spent too much time arguing about the perfect form of justice while ignoring the smell of fish wafting in from the harbor. Athens was noisy, proud, and still nursing the bruises of its rivalry with Sparta. Enter Plato, the philosopher with a knack for taking complicated ideas and turning them into dialogue-driven stories. If you've ever had to slog through the Republic or Phaedo in school, you'll know he liked to package philosophy in the form of conversations, imaginary ones, usually starring his old teacher Socrates as the world's most patient question-answerer. Somewhere around 360 BCE, Plato sat down to write Timaeus and Critias. These weren't his most famous works, but tucked inside them is a story that would outlive nearly everything else he wrote. In these texts, Plato has Critias, one of the dialogue's speakers, recount a tale passed down from Solon, the great Athenian statesman. Solon, we're told, learned it from Egyptian priests during his travels. The story goes like this. There was once a mighty island, larger than Libya and Asia combined, located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. This island was rich, fertile, and blessed with resources. Its people, descended from Poseidon himself, built a civilization of immense wealth and power. They created a city unlike any other, with concentric rings of land and water, canals that shimmered in the sun, temples plated in silver and gold, and harbors packed with ships. They were the Atlanteans. It sounds like something out of a travel brochure crossed with a utopian blueprint. But here's the kicker. According to Plato, this glittering civilization didn't last. As the Atlanteans grew more powerful, they grew more arrogant. They stopped caring about virtue and justice. They became greedy, warlike, and cruel. So the gods decided to teach them a lesson. In one day and one night of misfortune, earthquakes and floods swallowed the island, dragging it into the sea. Atlantis was no more. That's the whole story. No extended lore, no long chronicle of dynasties, no map drawn on sheepskin. Just that. A city, a rise, a fall, a disappearance. For Plato, it was a parable, a warning about what happens when a civilization forgets humility and virtue. He wanted his readers to think about Athens, about hubris, about balance. Atlantis was meant to be a mirror, not a mystery. And yet, from the very beginning, the story had hooks. First, there was the detail. Plato wasn't vague. He described the layout, the geography, even the kind of metal they mined, orichalcum, which conveniently no one has ever seen in real life. Second, he placed it in real geography, beyond the Pillars of Heracles. And third, he told it as if it were true, passed down by credible sources. Was Plato just making it up? Almost certainly. But he wrapped it in enough pseudo-history that later readers couldn't resist treating it as a genuine report. Think about it. Most ancient myths feel obviously mythical. Zeus throwing thunderbolts, Odysseus chatting with a cyclops, that sort of thing. But Atlantis felt possible. It felt like it could have been real, which is probably why the story refused to die. Ironically, the dialogues where Atlantis appears are unfinished. Critias cuts off mid-sentence like Plato got bored, got sick, or just decided he'd made his point, so we never even get the full tale. The world's most famous lost civilization is, fittingly, preserved only in fragments. For centuries, the story just sort of sat there, tucked into the collected works of Plato, read by scholars but not obsessed over. It was only much later, long after Plato's Athens had fallen into ruins, that people began to treat Atlantis like an actual historical mystery. But here, at the start, Atlantis is exactly what Plato meant it to be, a philosophical bedtime story, a tale designed to remind Athenians that too much pride leads to downfall, and that even the mightiest civilizations can vanish overnight. It's not sci-fi, it's not prophecy, it's Plato wagging his finger saying, "Don't get cocky." And yet, somehow that finger-wagging parable became one of the most enduring mysteries in human imagination. If Plato had stopped at Atlantis was a powerful island that got destroyed for being arrogant, the whole story probably would have faded into the dusty corners of philosophy, remembered only by professors and the occasional trivia enthusiast. But he didn't stop there. He painted Atlantis with such rich detail that it became irresistible. He gave the world just enough imagery to linger in the imagination forever. So let's drift into his description and imagine it, not as a footnote in a philosophical dialogue, but as a living place. Picture an island sitting proudly in the Atlantic, bigger than most countries of the time, its fertile plains stretching wide, its mountains catching the clouds. Water glistens everywhere because, according to Plato, Atlantis wasn't just land, it was rings of land and water, concentric circles carved by nature and perfected by engineering. Think of a target drawn into the earth, alternating bands of soil and shimmering canals, all connected by bridges and causeways. At the very center, a temple gleaming in gold and silver, dedicated to Poseidon, the god who supposedly fathered the Atlantean kings. And it wasn't some shabby mud brick setup. This was a city of abundance. The soil produced 2 harvests a year thanks to rains and irrigation. Fruits, grains, vegetables all grew in ridiculous plenty. Herds of animals grazed, exotic birds flocked, and the seas teemed with fish. If you were a hungry traveler stumbling upon Atlantis, you'd think you'd reached paradise. And that's kind of the point. Plato was describing an ideal civilization, the kind that had everything humanity could want. Then there was the metal. Atlantis, he said, was rich in orichalcum, a mysterious substance, second only to gold in value, said to shimmer with fiery light. Archaeologists today roll their eyes at that one because no such metal has ever been found. But you can imagine how later readers latched onto it. A lost civilization with a lost supermetal. That's basically conspiracy theory catnip. The city itself was arranged like a masterpiece of urban planning. The concentric rings weren't just pretty, they were functional. Ships glided through the water channels straight into vast harbors where fleets of triremes could be docked. High walls encircled each level, plated with bronze, tin, and even gold. Temples towered above the city, decorated with ivory, precious stones, and statues of gods and kings. Even the bulls sacrificed to Poseidon were part of a ritual spectacle, paraded through courts before their blood was spilled on polished altars. It sounds decadent, doesn't it? A little too decadent, perhaps. But that's the genius of Plato's description. He wasn't just sketching paradise, he was building a stage for the tragedy of hubris. You could practically feel that this was too perfect, too polished, too rich to last. Now keep in mind, none of this was written like a travelogue. Plato didn't actually expect someone to book a vacation there. His details served a purpose. They made Atlantis vivid enough to feel real, which made his cautionary tale hit harder. If he had kept it vague, some island somewhere got greedy and sank, his readers would have shrugged and moved on. By painting the temples in gold, by describing the canals and harbors, by mentioning exotic resources, he made Atlantis feel tantalizingly concrete. And that concreteness is exactly why the story escaped philosophy and became legend. Humans are visual creatures. We latch onto imagery more than abstract lessons. Plato could talk about justice and virtue until the amphorae of wine ran dry, but what stuck was the picture of a glittering city swallowed by the sea. Let's also not ignore how much Atlantis sounded like a greatest hits mashup of every civilization Plato knew about. The fertile plains and canals, straight out of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the concentric harbors and fleets, echoes of Carthage and Athens, the temple glinting with precious metals. That's Greece's own obsession with decorating shrines in marble and gold. In many ways, Plato was remixing familiar elements into one utopian meets catastrophe myth. The fact that people later treated it like a report says more about human gullibility than his intentions. But back to the scene. Picture yourself walking the streets of Atlantis. The air carries the salty tang of the sea mixed with the smoke of sacrificial fires. Merchants shout in markets laden with fruits, fabrics, and ores. Priests in white robes climb steps to the golden temple, chanting to Poseidon. Ships creak in the harbors, their sails billowing as crews prepare to set out on voyages across the ocean. Above it all, the palace gleams, a symbol of order and power, while in the fields beyond, farmers dig canals under the watchful gaze of the gods. It's almost too cinematic, isn't it? Which is why people throughout history have taken Plato's words and imagined entire civilizations out of them. Artists sketch palaces rising from the sea. Writers describe Atlantean technology that outstripped our own. Tour guides in Santorini or the Azores still wave their hands vaguely at the horizon and say, "Some say it was here." But let's not forget the subtle detail in Plato's framing. Atlantis was already in decline. Even in his lush description, there are hints of arrogance. The people, once noble and just, had begun to lose their virtue. They had wealth, yes, but it was corrupting them. They had power, but it was driving them toward conquest. It's the classic "things were better in the old days" trope, written in marble and salt water. And so the dazzling description becomes a setup for the fall. Atlantis wasn't perfect, it was doomed. And maybe that's the real reason the description captivates us even now, because it promises paradise but hints at tragedy. It's the same tension that fuels every good story, from Shakespeare to Hollywood. We love to imagine glory, but we can't look away from ruin. So here's the paradox. Atlantis, in Plato's telling, was both a dream and a warning. The fertile fields, the gleaming metals, the concentric harbors, they were all designed to seduce the imagination, but behind them lurked a moral. No civilization, no matter how rich or advanced, survives arrogance. The more perfect it seems, the more fragile it becomes. And that paradox is exactly why the description stuck. Atlantis wasn't just any lost world, it was the best lost world. Beautiful, prosperous, enviable, and gone in an instant. A bedtime story for civilizations everywhere. Now that we've walked through Plato's lush description of Atlantis, the canals, the concentric rings, the temples plated in gold, it's worth pausing to consider how he framed the people themselves. Because if the geography and architecture were designed to dazzle, the Atlanteans were written to impress, at least at first. In the beginning, they were the poster children for civilization done right. Plato makes it clear, the Atlanteans started off as a virtuous society. They had plenty of resources, but they weren't greedy. They had power, but they used it responsibly. Think of it as the honeymoon phase of civilization. The gods had handed them a paradise, and for a while they played by the rules. They were just, orderly, and pious. The laws were fair, the leaders disciplined, and the people industrious. It was, in Plato's words, a society built on sound principles. That's part of why the Atlantis story hits so hard. It begins with everything going right. This wasn't some barbarian backwater. This was a civilization so advanced and so abundant that it could serve as a model. Plato basically described them as the neighbors who somehow managed to have a spotless house, perfect kids, and a vegetable garden that never gets eaten by rabbits. And we all know how that story usually ends: envy, downfall, or both. So what did this perfect civilization look like in practice? For starters, justice and order. Atlantis was supposedly divided into 10 kingdoms, each ruled by a king descended from Poseidon and a mortal woman. These kings were bound together by laws inscribed on a column of orichalcum in the central temple. Imagine it, a glowing metal pillar engraved with commandments in a city already shimmering with bronze and gold. The kings would gather every few years, sacrifice bulls in a ritual court, and renew their oaths of fairness and unity. It was like a divine shareholders' meeting, but with more incense and a lot more blood. Economically, Atlantis was absurdly blessed. The fertile plains produced crops in abundance. The mountains overflowed with metals, wood, and game. The seas provided fish and trade routes, and rather than hoard all of this wealth for show, the Atlanteans at first seemed to use it wisely. They built temples, maintained their harbors, and supposedly lived in a balance of luxury and moderation. Philosophically, if we take Plato's word for it, they were also tuned into higher principles. They honored the gods, kept their laws, and lived in relative harmony. In a world where Greek city-states were constantly squabbling, the idea of 10 kings united under one code must have seemed almost utopian. No endless bickering in the assembly, no coups in the night, just orderly cooperation under the divine eye of Poseidon. But of course, there's a shadow here. You can almost hear Plato smirking between the lines. Because whenever a story paints a society as too perfect, you know what's coming next. He makes sure to mention that this virtue, this balance, this idyllic justice, it didn't last. The rot began slowly. With wealth came complacency. With abundance came arrogance. Over time, the Atlanteans started to lose their sense of proportion. They had so much that they began to crave more. Instead of being content with their concentric harbors and glittering temples, they wanted empires. Instead of sacrificing bulls in piety, they performed the rituals more out of habit than devotion. It's the classic tale. The very success that made them strong started to corrode their character. And here's the uncomfortable bit. Doesn't that sound familiar? How many times in history have we seen the same arc play out? Rome, Britain, maybe even modern nations today. Prosperity breeds hubris, hubris breeds overreach, and overreach breeds collapse. It's almost like Plato wasn't describing an island at all. He was describing a cycle, one that repeats itself across civilizations. Still, for a while, the Atlanteans were the shining example. Imagine life there during this golden age. Farmers tending to fields so fertile they barely had to struggle. Markets bustling with goods from across the seas. Craftsmen working metals no one else had ever seen, shaping ornaments and weapons that gleamed unnaturally bright. Kings meeting in solemn rituals, reaffirming laws beneath the gaze of Poseidon's golden statue. Families living in stone houses, shaded by gardens with food and water always at hand. It was, in short, everything humans ever said they wanted. Order, abundance, peace, a perfect society, or as close as we're ever likely to get, at least in myth. And maybe that's the secret to why Atlantis haunts us. Because deep down, every culture imagines a golden age, a time when the world was kinder, simpler, better. Atlantis gave that dream a home address. But Plato wasn't about to let his audience get too comfortable. He sets it up beautifully, the perfection, the justice, the virtue, so that when he pulls the rug, it hits harder. Because what follows isn't just the fall of a city, it's the fall of the idea that any civilization can remain perfect forever. So if you're lying there, listening, maybe drifting toward sleep, let this thought settle in gently. Perfection is always temporary. Civilizations, like people, start strong, then stumble. Atlantis, in Plato's telling, was the ultimate cautionary tale. No matter how golden the temples, no matter how fertile the fields, hubris waits at the door. And once it's inside, paradise doesn't last long. That was the perfect civilization, gleaming, just and orderly, but already fragile. The cracks were forming, even as the walls shone with gold. And it's those cracks that will widen into the story's great tragedy. So why did Atlantis stick? Why did one story, tucked into a pair of Plato's dialogues, outlive nearly every other tale from the ancient world? Let's be clear. Plato wasn't the only one spinning yarns in classical Athens. Philosophers, poets, and playwrights were constantly making up parables, allegories, and elaborate metaphors to keep their audiences awake. Most of those stories have withered into footnotes, but Atlantis, somehow, grew roots that still clutch at our imagination 2.5 millennia later. The first reason is simple. It's memorable. A lot of ancient myths are complicated. They're full of gods with confusing family trees, plots that contradict themselves, and morals that change depending on who's telling the story. Atlantis, by contrast, is clean. One island, one civilization, one dramatic fall. It has a beginning, middle, and end. It's neat, almost too neat, like a fable designed to stick in the brain. And then there's the imagery. You can't overstate how much Plato's description helps. Golden temples, concentric rings of canals, a navy of 1,000 ships, fertile plains and mountains brimming with metal. Even if you forget the philosophy, the visuals lodge themselves in the mind. Compare it to, say, another allegory Plato used, his famous cave, where people mistake shadows for reality. That's an important idea, sure, but visually it's just people staring at a wall. Atlantis, that's Hollywood material right there. There's also the tone. Atlantis isn't framed as an obvious fable. Plato drops it in with a straight face, presented as a story passed down from Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver, who supposedly heard it from Egyptian priests. It has just enough scaffolding of history to make people wonder if it might actually be true. It's like telling your friend a ghost story and swearing that it happened to your cousin's neighbor's uncle. It blurs the line between fiction and fact, and that blur is irresistible. But beyond the aesthetics, there's the deeper reason. Atlantis hits a nerve that almost every human culture shares, the idea of a lost golden age. From Eden to El Dorado, we are obsessed with imagining a time when the world was better, richer, purer, and then somehow lost. Atlantis was Plato's version of that myth. It wasn't just a city, it was the embodiment of what could have been. And let's not forget the moral of the story. Atlantis wasn't just about abundance, it was about hubris. The Atlanteans started virtuous, then became arrogant, greedy, and corrupt. Their fall was a punishment, a divine reset button. That moral, prosperity leads to arrogance, arrogance leads to downfall, is one of history's favorite themes. It's timeless. You can apply it to empires, corporations, or even your neighbor who buys a fancy new car and immediately crashes it into a mailbox. The cautionary tale never goes out of style. There's also the question of timing. Plato lived in a world where Athens itself had risen, flourished, overreached, and stumbled. Just a generation before him, the city had been the superpower of Greece. It built an empire, flexed its wealth, and then watched it all unravel in the Peloponnesian War. When Plato described Atlantis as a great civilization that grew too big for its boots and got smacked down, Athenians didn't need a map to see the parallels. The story resonated because it felt eerily familiar. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Atlantis wasn't a myth that stayed in one place. It was a seed that sprouted in new soil every time it was retold. In the Renaissance, explorers and philosophers reimagined it as a proto-utopia, a model for how society should be organized. In the 19th and 20th centuries, it got swept up in theories about ancient super-civilizations, lost continents, and eventually aliens with suspiciously advanced technology. Every age reinterpreted it to reflect its own anxieties and fantasies. That adaptability is why it still lingers while other myths fade. Think about it. How often do you hear someone casually bring up the Epic of Gilgamesh at a dinner party? Probably never. But Atlantis, everyone knows the word, even if they don't know Plato from Play-Doh. The name itself has become shorthand for lost paradise. That's cultural staying power. And then, of course, there's the allure of mystery. If Plato had told us exactly where Atlantis was, we'd probably have dug it up or disproved it by now. But he didn't. He placed it beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar, then left the details vague. Was it in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, Antarctica, under all that ice? Pick a map, point at a body of water, and someone somewhere has argued that Atlantis is hidden beneath it. The uncertainty is half the fun. So here's the paradox. Plato may have invented Atlantis as an allegory, a moral lesson wrapped in a shiny package. But by making it so vivid, so ambiguous, and so tantalizing, he accidentally created a myth that outgrew him. Instead of serving as a neat little parable about the dangers of hubris, it became a global mystery that people still chase. Philosophers wanted us to think about virtue. Treasure hunters wanted to find the gold. Conspiracy theorists wanted the aliens. Everyone got something out of it. That's why Atlantis outlived nearly every other ancient tale. It wasn't just a story, it was a blank canvas, painted in gold and mystery, waiting for each generation to project its own fears and desires onto it. The seed Plato planted grew into a forest of speculation, debate, and obsession, and it shows no signs of dying out. So, as you lie here tonight listening, you might wonder, what stories from our own time will survive in the same way? Which myths, memes, or cautionary tales will echo thousands of years from now? Hard to say, but one thing is certain. Atlantis will still be there, shimmering in the collective imagination, forever just out of reach. That was the seed of the myth, the reason a simple story about an island sank deeper into our imagination than almost any other. And with that, we've reached the end of the first whispers of a lost world. Next, we'll step into Chapter 2, where Atlantis is no longer just an idea. It's a civilization flexing its power, expanding its reach, and edging closer to its downfall. Chapter 2. Rise, Power, and Hubris of the Atlanteans. If you want to give a civilization instant credibility in the ancient world, just claim your ruling family was descended from the gods. Works every time. And in the case of Atlantis, Plato didn't just pick any god to sit at the top of the family tree. He chose Poseidon, lord of the sea, which makes sense, really. If you're building a mythical island empire, who better than the god of saltwater tantrums, earthquakes, and the occasional romantic scandal to set things in motion? The story goes like this. Once upon a mythic time, Poseidon wandered across the vast ocean and stumbled upon a little island inhabited by mortals. Among them was a woman named Clito, described as beautiful, noble, and, depending on your translation, slightly tragic. Poseidon, being a Greek god, didn't exactly believe in restraint. He promptly fell in love with her, and in typical divine fashion, falling in love meant building her an elaborate home at the center of the island, encircled by rings of land and sea. Romantic, if you ignore the complete lack of consent laws in ancient mythology. Out of this union came 10 sons, 10 half-divine princes who would go on to rule the island, each carving out their own portion of Atlantis. At the top of the hierarchy was Atlas, the eldest, whose name gave the island its identity. He was the first king, and his siblings became rulers of their own districts, each commanding cities, harbors, and fertile plains that shimmered with abundance. It was less a democracy and more a divine franchise system, but in the mythic logic of the story, it worked, at least at first. The image Plato paints of these kings is fascinating. On the one hand, they were meant to embody divine justice, charged with ruling in harmony with Poseidon's law. Each king was responsible for maintaining order, protecting his people, and keeping the balance between wealth and humility. On the other hand, they lived in an environment dripping with resources: gold, silver, ivory, endless herds of animals, and fertile fields. It was like telling a group of rich kids to run a city responsibly while also giving them bottomless credit cards. You can probably guess how this was going to go. Still, in the early days, the system held. The kings of Atlantis met every few years in Poseidon's great temple, an enormous structure at the heart of the concentric city. There, they gathered to discuss laws, renew oaths, and sacrifice sacred bulls in ritual ceremonies. The rules were clear. No king could wage war on another. Decisions about justice were made collectively, and everyone was bound by divine law to maintain the order Poseidon had established. It sounds almost utopian, a kind of divine council where fairness trumped greed. And yet, even in Plato's telling, you can feel the shadow of corruption creeping in. The kings were descended from Poseidon, yes, but as generations passed, the divine blood diluted. Their godly heritage was mixed with more and more mortal lineage. Plato notes this explicitly. In the beginning, they were noble, just, and close to the divine, but over time their human side took over. It's an allegory for exactly what he wanted to say about civilizations in general. They begin with virtue, but wealth and power eventually erode their character. What's striking, though, is how human the Atlantean kings feel in this story. They're not cardboard cutouts of perfection. They're rulers trying to manage abundance, tempted by pride, and slowly losing their grip on justice. They sound less like mythic demigods and more like every royal family you've ever read about, great at PR in the beginning, then slowly devolving into squabbles, indulgence, and questionable decisions. It's almost as if Plato invented the first case study in dynastic decline. And while we're here, let's take a moment to appreciate how over-the-top Poseidon's architectural flair was. The palace he built for Clito and their sons was surrounded by alternating rings of land and water, carved with impossible precision. Bridges spanned the channels, gates and towers gleamed with metals. If you've ever seen those artistic reconstructions of Atlantis with glowing canals and shimmering walls, this is where it all started. You can almost picture Poseidon sketching it out like a mythological urban planner. Let's see. Moat, wall, temple, golden statue. Perfect. It's also worth noting that Atlas, the eldest son, wasn't just a figurehead. His name gave identity to the entire island, the land of Atlas, Atlantis. That naming trick is another reason the myth stuck. Names matter. When you tie a place's identity to a single, memorable figure, it anchors the story in people's minds. Atlas was not just a king. He was the brand ambassador of a lost world. Now, what does all of this tell us beyond the myth? Well, if you peel away the divine window dressing, you see Plato playing with a recurring theme in Greek thought: the tension between divine order and human weakness. The first Atlantean kings, fresh from Poseidon's bloodline, are symbols of harmony, justice, and restraint. But as that divinity weakens, their humanity, greedy, flawed, ambitious, takes over. The story isn't really about Atlantis so much as it is about every human civilization. Greatness is fragile, virtue is fleeting, and no empire, no matter how gilded, is safe from the slow creep of corruption. So here we are, standing at the gates of Atlantis, watching 10 kings in gleaming courts, sacrificing bulls to Poseidon, swearing oaths to govern justly, and enjoying a paradise of abundance. For the moment, everything is balanced, the lineage is strong, the system is working, but you can already hear the faint cracks forming, the whisper that too much wealth, too much power, and too much pride will eventually pull the whole thing apart. And that, my friends, is how Atlantis begins, not with a bang, not even with a flood, but with a divine love story, 10 royal sons, and a palace at the center of the sea. The kings are on their thrones, the temples glow with offerings, and the future looks bright. But as we know, myths don't last long when human nature gets involved. In the next part, we'll step out of the palace and into the wider world, watching as Atlantis flexes its muscles, builds fleets, and starts looking across the seas with hungry eyes. Because even paradise, it seems, can't resist expansion. So far, Atlantis has been sitting pretty. 10 kings descended from Poseidon, concentric walls gleaming, temples stuffed with offerings, and everyone more or less behaving. But civilizations never just sit still, do they? Give a group of rulers fertile fields, overflowing mines, and a naval advantage, and soon enough they start asking, what's next? Who can we conquer? And that, according to Plato, is exactly what happened to Atlantis. Picture it, a city-state on steroids. Atlantis wasn't just one island. It controlled a whole cluster of territories, with fertile plains spreading out in every direction and mountains stacked with ore. The kings had everything they needed: timber for ships, metals for weapons, herds for armies, and wealth pouring in from tribute. The concentric harbors buzzed with fleets, each ship fitted to sail beyond the horizon. If Athens was a scrappy little startup of democracy, Atlantis was the multinational corporation with bottomless resources, aggressive marketing, and a very loose ethics department. The Atlanteans, once content to rule their own paradise, began to look outward. They expanded across the seas, extending influence into parts of Europe, North Africa, and beyond. According to the myth, their empire stretched as far as Egypt and Italy, wrapping coastlines under their control. It wasn't just trade, it was domination. They weren't content with being the shining jewel of the ocean. They wanted to be the whole crown. What's so interesting here is how Plato frames it. He doesn't describe Atlantis's expansion as noble or admirable. He paints it as the beginning of moral decay. The Atlanteans had started with divine order, but the more territory they gobbled up, the less they remembered their humble, virtuous beginnings. They became greedy, arrogant, and cruel. Their empire wasn't about justice anymore. It was about power, prestige, and reminding everyone else that they were Poseidon's golden children. Think of it like the ancient version of lifestyle creep. At first, the kings lived in moderation, grateful for their abundance. But then, as resources piled up and conquests succeeded, moderation went out the window. Why settle for what you have when you can own everything? It's the kind of thinking that turns dinner parties into banquets, banquets into feasts, and feasts into yearly spectacles where bulls are sacrificed, gold is flaunted, and nobody remembers why they were supposed to be humble in the first place. And of course, expansion comes with enemies. The myth specifically highlights Athens as the scrappy underdog standing up to Atlantis's overwhelming might. Now, you might wonder, why Athens? Why not Carthage or Egypt or some other regional power? The answer is pretty transparent. Plato was using the story as a morality play, with Athens cast as the virtuous hero who resists the corruption of imperial excess. Atlantis was the foil, the arrogant empire whose ambition led to its doom. It's less about geography and more about philosophy. Athens versus everyone else, moderation versus greed, democracy versus tyranny. Still, if you take the imagery at face value, it's impressive. Picture Atlantean fleets, vast armadas of triremes cutting across the Mediterranean, harbors overflowing with ships, bronze gleaming in the sun, sails snapping in the wind, soldiers marching down gangplanks armored in metals no one else had in such quantity. Imagine being a farmer on some quiet coastline looking up to see the horizon dark with ships, each one carrying the promise of tribute, conquest, or destruction. To the storyteller's audience, Atlantis was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, a vision of what happens when unchecked power sails too far from home. And here's the thing, Plato's audience would have understood this perfectly. They lived in a world where empires rose and fell on the strength of their fleets. Athens itself had once been the dominant naval power, flexing its triremes during the Persian Wars and later bullying its allies in the Delian League. The Athenians knew all too well the temptations of maritime supremacy. In many ways, Atlantis was just Athens turned up to 11. An exaggerated reflection of what expansion and arrogance could lead to. There's also a subtle warning here about the fragility of empires. When a state expands too quickly, its foundations crack. Administrations struggle to govern far-flung territories. Armies stretch thin. Resources that once seemed endless start to drain. And above all, the ruling elite forget the principles that made them strong in the first place. For Atlantis, that meant losing the divine spark, the sense of justice that Poseidon's bloodline supposedly guaranteed. In its place came hunger for land, for wealth, for glory that could never be satisfied. It's almost funny in a dry, cynical way. The Atlanteans already lived in paradise. They had fertile fields, perfect climate, minerals, harbors, and gods on their side. And still they wanted more. Human nature, right? Give us Eden and we'll immediately ask where the next real estate development is going up. And so Atlantis's expansion became its defining feature. Armies marched, fleets sailed, territories fell. The island wasn't just a home anymore. It was an empire, one that cast its shadow across the known world. But that shadow came at a cost. The more the Atlanteans conquered, the less virtuous they became. The more they sought power, the closer they came to hubris, the fatal flaw of Greek tragedy. Plato doesn't go into military details, but you can imagine them. Vast formations of soldiers in bronze armor, shields glinting, spears raised, naval battles with ships colliding, boarding parties clashing, the sea itself foaming with the chaos of war. These images, even if exaggerated, would have lingered in the minds of listeners. Atlantis wasn't just rich, it was powerful, and power unchecked never ends well. So here we are, in the middle of Atlantis's golden age, watching it flex across seas and lands. The kings, once bound by sacred oaths, are now more concerned with tribute than justice. The empire grows fat on conquest, but beneath the glittering surface something is beginning to rot. Expansion isn't just a dream anymore, it's a warning. And the very strength that made Atlantis mighty is already pulling it toward its eventual downfall. In the next part, we'll step inside the city itself to see what this empire looked like at its peak. Golden walls, sacred bulls, and harbors overflowing with ships. The city of superlatives. But don't be fooled. Behind every gilded temple and marble wall, the shadow of hubris is growing. If you've been waiting for the glossy brochure tour of Atlantis, this is it. Plato doesn't skimp on the details here. He gives us a city so extravagant it makes Las Vegas look like a quiet retirement town. This isn't just a capital. It's a showroom of abundance dripping with metals, marble, and religious theatrics, designed to make sure everyone, from local farmers to foreign dignitaries, understood exactly how much wealth and power the Atlanteans commanded. Picture the heart of the city, not one wall, but 3 massive rings of walls, each one plated in different metals. The outer wall gleamed with red copper, the middle with shining tin, and the innermost with orichalcum, a mysterious alloy Plato claims glowed like fire. Historians still scratch their heads over that one. Was it bronze, brass, or just Plato's way of saying, imagine the fanciest material possible? Whatever it was, it shimmered. Imagine walking toward that central island, each concentric wall brighter and rarer than the last, like stepping through layers of a jewel box. And at the very center, rising above the city, the temple of Poseidon and Clito, his mortal consort. This wasn't a quaint shrine with a couple of incense sticks. We're talking massive columns sheathed in silver, ceilings gilded with ivory, statues of gods made from a mix of gold, silver, and orichalcum, each one so large and polished they must have looked alive in the torchlight. At the heart stood a colossal statue of Poseidon himself, driving 6 winged horses, so tall his head nearly touched the temple roof. For the citizens of Atlantis, this wasn't just art. It was a constant reminder that their empire was divinely endorsed, and for visitors, it was intimidation by architecture. Surrounding the temple were courts where bulls were led in for sacrifice. Yes, bulls, lots of them. Plato describes rituals where Atlantean kings would gather in the temple, capture a bull within the sacred precinct, and then carve it up in a lavish ceremony. They'd swear oaths over its blood, pledging to uphold justice and harmony. The irony, of course, is that by the time these rituals were at their peak, Atlantis was already sliding into arrogance and decay. Nothing says we're definitely virtuous like making increasingly elaborate promises while doing the opposite outside the temple walls. Now, let's step back and picture the harbors. If the temple was Atlantis flexing its religious muscles, the harbors were its economic brag. Vast docks stretched along the concentric canals, lined with ships of every shape and size. Merchant vessels creaked under the weight of goods, ivory, spices, timber, metals, livestock. War fleets sat ready to launch, their hulls gleaming in the sun, their sails coiled tight. The smell would have been overwhelming. Tar, salt, fish, sweat, and the ever-present smoke of forges pounding out bronze weapons. It wasn't just busy, it was orchestrated chaos, the kind of bustle that screams wealth and power. Every detail of the city screamed superlative. Gardens overflowed with fruit trees, fountains spouted in courtyards, and canals crisscrossed the plain, keeping fields lush year-round. Bridges spanned the rings of water, each one carved and decorated so that even infrastructure was turned into a showpiece. The Atlanteans weren't content with functionality. Everything had to dazzle, to remind everyone that they were living in paradise. But paradise comes with fine print. The wealth wasn't shared equally. Behind the gold-plated facades, ordinary workers still hauled timber, mined ore, and farmed the plains in brutal conditions. Someone had to sweat for all that grandeur. You can imagine the contrast. A king parading into the temple in embroidered robes while a miner stumbled home caked in dust. The city of superlatives wasn't built on divine magic. It was built on labor, grinding, endless, human labor. Plato, of course, wasn't describing this as a tourist guide. He was setting up the cautionary tale. The Atlanteans' dazzling city was already a symptom of their excess. the temple sacrifices, the gleaming metals, the harbors overflowing with ships, all of it revealed not virtue, but vanity. They weren't just serving Poseidon anymore, they were serving their own pride. And yet, it's easy to see why the description has endured. People love Atlantis not because it fell, but because of how it looked before it fell. The glittering city, the golden walls, the colossal statue of Poseidon. It's irresistible. Even today, when you close your eyes and imagine Atlantis, you probably don't picture it sinking into the sea. You picture it shining, glowing, perfect, humming with life and luxury. That's the image that sticks. So here's the paradox. Atlantis is remembered as a tragedy, but its enduring power comes from the fantasy of its perfection. The superlative city, the harbor full of ships, the temples dripping with gold, a paradise built by gods, ruined by men, and as we drift through its boulevards and plazas, we can't help but wonder, would we have done any better if given the same wealth and power, or would we, too, have plated our walls in precious metals and sworn empty oaths over sacrificial bulls? That was the city of superlatives, dazzling on the outside, decaying on the inside. And as the Atlanteans basked in their splendor, they were already stepping closer to the edge. Because in myths, as in life, the higher the walls shine, the harder the fall will be. Up to now, Atlantis sounds like a dream pulled from the glossy pages of a travel magazine. Gleaming walls, endless wealth, temples dripping with ivory and gold. But as every mythmaker knows, paradise doesn't stay pristine for long. This is the part of the story where the Atlanteans stop being the heroic children of Poseidon and start acting like, well, humans, ambitious, greedy, and a little too full of themselves. If Atlantis had a Yelp review, this would be the point where the stars start dropping. Plato makes it clear. The Atlanteans began virtuous. In the early days, their kings supposedly ruled with moderation. They respected the divine order, shared their wealth fairly, and lived in harmony with the gods. Imagine that. No cutthroat politics, no shady business deals, no kings building palaces just to show off. But virtue has an expiration date. Wealth and power have a way of turning humility into arrogance, and Atlantis was no exception. The decline started small. Think of it like a slow leak in a grand ship. You don't notice at first, but over time the water creeps higher. Atlantean kings who once swore oaths over sacrificial bulls began breaking those promises. Where they once claimed to uphold justice, they started bending rules to their advantage. Greed seeped in. The empire's fleets, once symbols of defense and prosperity, became tools for conquest. Instead of protecting their lands, Atlanteans began eyeing other territories with hungry ambition. This shift is crucial. Atlantis wasn't just rich, it was restless. Wealth on that scale doesn't like sitting still. The rulers began expanding outward, not content with their lush plains and glittering city. Neighboring lands looked tempting, and soon their fleets were crossing seas, absorbing smaller islands and intimidating coastal regions. To outside nations, Atlantis must have looked less like a divine paradise and more like a neighborhood bully with golden walls. It's worth pausing here because Plato isn't describing this as a neutral historian. He's spinning a moral tale, and Athens, the city where he lived, plays the foil. In the story, while Atlantis grows corrupt and power-hungry, Athens stands as the plucky defender of virtue, resisting Atlantean expansion with noble courage. Convenient, isn't it? Plato may as well have written, "Go Team Athens," in the margins. But whether or not the details are political propaganda, the turning point is the same. Atlantis stops being an example of harmony and becomes a warning about hubris. Picture the arrogance of the Atlantean elite, kings throwing feasts not to honor Poseidon, but to flaunt their wealth. Processions where the gods were invoked less out of devotion and more as a backdrop to show off embroidered robes and jeweled cups. Laws twisted to protect the powerful, leaving ordinary people further burdened. It's a pattern as old as civilization itself. Power centralizes, virtue erodes, and suddenly the grand empire is built less on justice and more on exploitation. The irony is thick. Remember those bulls sacrificed in solemn rituals to renew oaths of fairness and humility? Those ceremonies continued, but by then they had become hollow performances. Kings swore by the gods while ignoring every principle they promised to uphold. It was ancient theatre, piety as PR. Sound familiar? Swap the ivory statues for press conferences, and the dynamic isn't so different from modern times. As Atlantis leaned into conquest, its reputation shifted. Once admired, now feared. Imagine being a merchant from a smaller island, watching Atlantean ships sail into harbor, sleek, intimidating, bristling with soldiers. The message was clear: pay tribute or get flattened. Empires often convince themselves they're spreading order and civilization. To everyone else it looks like coercion. And here's the thing. Plato frames this shift not just as a political mistake, but as a cosmic one. The Atlanteans weren't simply bad rulers. They were betraying the divine gift Poseidon had given them. Their hubris wasn't just arrogance against neighbors, it was arrogance against the gods. And in myth, that's the kind of mistake that doesn't just earn a bad harvest. It earns destruction. If you squint, you can already see the fall foreshadowed. The same concentric canals that made Atlantis flourish also symbolize separation, the elite gleaming at the center, the commoners and conquered peoples pushed outward. The same fleets that carried goods also carried war. The same oaths that once kept justice alive became meaningless recitations. What was once harmony had become division, indulgence, and decay. So the turning point of Atlantis wasn't a single cataclysmic event. It was a slow unraveling, a shift from humility to pride, from reverence to arrogance, from balance to excess. And just as the story builds the city of superlatives up, it prepares to tear it all down. Because in myth, the higher the pedestal, the harder the fall. And in Atlantis, the pedestal was plated with gold. Chapter 3. The Fall and the Mystery that Followed. So here we are. The grand stage is set, the actors are in place, and Atlantis is teetering on the edge. We've seen the shining city at its peak, gleaming walls, bustling harbors, kings swearing oaths over sacred bulls. We've also watched its decline into arrogance, greed, and conquest. And if you know anything about myth, you know what comes next. When gods hand you paradise and you treat it like a personal playground, the bill eventually comes due. For Atlantis, that bill arrived in the form of cataclysm. Plato puts it in stark, almost casual words, as though he were noting a weather report. In a single day and night of misfortune, Atlantis was swallowed by the sea. Just like that, one of the greatest civilizations the world supposedly ever knew vanished beneath waves and storms. No drawn-out war, no long decline, no negotiations, just destruction, immediate and final. It's hard to overstate the drama of this scene. Imagine it. One moment, Atlanteans are living their lives, merchants tallying goods, priests muttering half-hearted prayers, kings reclining in golden halls. The next, the ground shudders. Earthquakes ripple through palaces. Walls that had stood for centuries crack and collapse. The canals that once fed the city's fields are suddenly roaring torrents, bursting their banks, swallowing homes, sweeping away livestock and families alike. The sky darkens, storms roll in, heavy with rain and thunder. as if the gods themselves were pounding drums of judgment. Lightning lashes the golden walls, splitting towers, setting fires that can't be extinguished before being drowned. Ships are tossed like toys in a bathtub, proud fleets reduced to splintered wreckage within hours. And then the sea rises, unstoppable, merciless, consuming the land itself. By morning, all that remained of Atlantis, Plato tells us, was a shoal of mud, impassable to ships. Now let's pause for a second. We're talking about a myth, but myths are designed to hit you where it hurts. This wasn't just about a city disappearing. It was about divine justice delivered with finality. The gods, in their stern boredom, had decided the Atlanteans had overstepped, and in one swoop they erased centuries of splendor. No slow decline, no chance to rebuild, just a cosmic reset button slammed down. But think about the emotional weight for the listener in Plato's time. Imagine being an Athenian hearing this tale. You're told about this vast empire, richer, stronger, grander than anything Greece had ever seen, and then you're told it fell, utterly and completely because of arrogance and corruption. The moral is clear. If Atlantis, with all its gold, fleets, and divine favor, couldn't survive hubris, what hope do you have if you go down the same road? It's myth as warning label. The details are fascinating too. A single day and night. Why emphasize that? Because the swiftness is the point. Hubris makes you think you're secure, untouchable. Catastrophe reminds you you're not. One day you're a superpower, the next you're a mud bank no one can sail through. It's myth distilled into something almost brutally efficient. Of course, modern imaginations can't leave it there. Over the centuries, countless people have tried to reconstruct what the cataclysm might have looked like in real terms. Was it a volcanic eruption, like the one that shattered Santorini and buried Minoan civilization? Was it a tsunami triggered by an earthquake like the ones that have devastated coasts across history? Was it climate collapse, slow but relentless, written as a single night of doom in the story? Each theory tries to ground the cataclysm in something concrete, something geological. But maybe that misses the point. Plato wasn't writing a geological report. He was writing a parable. The destruction of Atlantis wasn't about tectonic plates or volcanic ash. It was about morality, about showing that even the most dazzling civilization can be wiped away if it forgets its place in the order of things. Still, the imagery lingers. You can't help but picture it. The concentric rings of the city, swallowed one by one, the sacred temple of Poseidon vanishing under crashing waves, statues toppling, gold and ivory swallowed by black water, streets that once echoed with markets and festivals buried beneath silt and silence. It's a vision designed to lodge in your imagination, to haunt you, to whisper that no matter how secure life feels, disaster is always possible. And maybe that's why the cataclysm has captivated so many for so long, because deep down, humans have always known how fragile civilization is. Floods, earthquakes, fires. Our ancestors lived with those threats daily. Atlantis turns that anxiety into a story, one that feels both terrifying and oddly satisfying. The bad guys got what they deserved. The gods restored balance. Order returned, even if it meant obliteration. But here's the irony. The destruction of Atlantis didn't erase it. Quite the opposite. It cemented it. A city that had supposedly vanished forever became immortal precisely because it was lost. The absence made it eternal. People could imagine it however they wanted, fill in the gaps with whatever fears or hopes they carried. The cataclysm didn't kill Atlantis. It made it unkillable. So as the waves closed over golden walls and the storms quieted, Atlantis slipped from history into legend. And that's where it's lived ever since, just out of reach, half believed, half denied, always lingering like a dream at the edge of memory. And that's where we'll go next. Not the end of Atlantis, but the endless afterlife of its story. Because once Plato buried it beneath the waves, generations after him couldn't resist trying to dig it back up. So Atlantis sinks beneath the sea in a single day and night. End of story, right? You'd think so. Plato wraps it up neatly, lesson delivered. Arrogance leads to ruin, don't let it happen to you. But if history teaches us anything, it's that humans are terrible at leaving mysteries alone. Give us a half-finished story and we'll spend the next 2,000 years doodling in the margins, inventing new endings, new explanations, and entirely new genres of speculation. Atlantis is the ultimate blank canvas. Plato tells us just enough to tantalize, where it supposedly sat beyond the pillars of Heracles, how it looked, why it fell. But then he leaves out all the details we crave. The exact location, archaeological proof, corroborating witnesses. It's like dropping the juiciest cliffhanger in history and then refusing to write a sequel. And so, every age since has picked up the pen and scribbled its own theories. Let's start with the ancients themselves. The Greeks and Romans for the most part shrugged. To them Atlantis was a moral fable, not a treasure map. They already had plenty of myths about floods, hubris, and angry gods, so Plato's sunken island was filed away as another cautionary tale, not a lost continent worth mounting expeditions over. Aristotle, Plato's student, apparently dismissed the whole story, muttering that the old man had invented Atlantis to make a point and nothing more. For centuries the legend floated in the background, interesting but not urgent. But myths are patient. They sit quietly until the cultural winds shift in their favor. Fast forward to the Renaissance, an age obsessed with rediscovery. Europe had just stumbled onto the Americas, proving that yes, there were entire continents out there that old maps had missed. Suddenly, Plato's tale didn't feel so far-fetched. If half the world could be hiding behind the Atlantic, why not a lost island too? Scholars and dreamers began to dig back into Timaeus and Critias, reading them less like philosophy and more like early geography. And then came the utopians. Thinkers like Thomas More, who literally coined the word utopia, were fascinated by the idea of a lost, perfect society. Atlantis became less a cautionary tale and more an inspiration. Writers sketched imaginary islands where justice reigned, wealth was shared, and life was orderly, basically the opposite of their messy, plague-ridden, war-torn Europe. Atlantis, in their hands, wasn't a failure. It was an ideal worth chasing, a dream to rebuild. Conveniently, nobody had to prove it ever existed. The point wasn't archaeology, it was imagination. By the Enlightenment, Atlantis had been drafted into scientific debates. Early naturalists and explorers speculated that maybe Atlantis had been a real land bridge, connecting Europe to the Americas, explaining similarities in flora, fauna, and even myths. You see versions of this idea pop up in the 18th and 19th centuries. Atlantis as the missing puzzle piece in human migration, a kind of prehistoric airport lounge where cultures mingled before scattering. Never mind that geology wasn't quite on their side. It made for good lecture hall chatter. But the real pivot came with archaeology, or more accurately, with archaeology's early missteps. In the late 19th century, Heinrich Schliemann dug up Troy, proving that a city once dismissed as pure myth actually had some basis in fact. That discovery rattled people. If Homer's Troy was real, maybe Plato's Atlantis was too. The door cracked open, and suddenly Atlantis fever spread through Europe like incense smoke at a festival. Every ruin, Every odd-shaped rock, every sunken coastline became a candidate for the lost city. And then came the modern spins, the kind that belong less in museums and more on late-night cable television. The 20th century gave Atlantis to mystics, theosophists, and eventually UFO enthusiasts. Helena Blavatsky, founder of Theosophy, reimagined Atlantis as a cradle of hidden wisdom, home to advanced spiritual beings whose knowledge was lost in the flood. Edgar Cayce, the so-called sleeping prophet, doubled down, claiming Atlantis was technologically advanced, powered by mysterious crystals, and would one day rise again off the coast of the Bahamas. Because of course it would, and once Atlantis slipped into the orbit of UFO lore, there was no going back. Suddenly, the Atlanteans weren't just arrogant mortals punished by gods. They were aliens, time travelers, or interdimensional beings who left us tantalizing clues in pyramids and stone circles. Atlantis wasn't destroyed by an angry Poseidon, but by nuclear weapons, or energy beams gone wrong, or cosmic alignments we still don't understand. Every generation added its anxieties to the story. Cold War paranoia became tales of ancient superweapons. New Age optimism became glowing crystals and psychic powers. Even today, Atlantis refuses to sit quietly on the shelf. Type it into YouTube and you'll get everything from sober lectures by archaeologists insisting it was just allegory to enthusiastic narrators connecting it to Antarctica, Mars, or the Bermuda Triangle. Atlantis has become a kind of intellectual Rorschach test. Skeptics see a fable, mystics see lost wisdom, conspiracy theorists see cover-ups. Everyone sees what they want, and that's the strange beauty of it. Atlantis survives not because it was real, but because it was never fully explained. The gaps in the story act like open doors, inviting us to step in with our own fears, hopes, and theories. Flood myths in Egypt, the volcanic eruption at Santorini, Renaissance utopias, New Age crystals, it all gets folded into the same legend, reshaping it again and again. Think about that for a moment. A single unfinished tale told by one philosopher over 2,000 years ago has spawned libraries of speculation, waves of obsession, and an entire genre of lost world storytelling. From theosophy pamphlets to ancient aliens, Atlantis has been everything from a parable about hubris to a cosmic origin story for humanity itself. And maybe that's the real secret. Atlantis endures not because Plato told us everything, but because he told us almost nothing. The mystery is the hook. The silence is what keeps us talking. Atlantis is one of those stories where you can tell exactly what kind of person someone is just by how they react to it. Some people lean back, smile, and say, well, clearly it's just Plato's metaphor for hubris. Others lean forward, lower their voice, and start explaining how the CIA is hiding ruins in the mid-Atlantic trench, and both of them, annoyingly, are confident they're right. On the sober, dusty side of the debate, we have the archaeologists and historians, the people who have dedicated their lives to translating crumbling bits of cuneiform or brushing dirt off broken amphorae. To them, Atlantis is straightforward. It's a story, a good story, yes, and one that says a lot about Plato's worldview, but not a historical record. Plato was not in the business of investigative journalism. He was a philosopher, spinning elaborate dialogues to illustrate his ideas about politics, virtue, and the fate of societies. Atlantis was a teaching tool, not a travel brochure. The evidence, or rather, the lack of it, backs this up. Despite centuries of searching, there are no ruins of concentric cities sitting on the seabed, no inscriptions saying, "Welcome to Atlantis, population 20,000, no geological traces of a vanished continent in the Atlantic. The ocean floor has been mapped with satellites and sonar. If an island the size Plato described had sunk in the relatively recent past, the scar would be obvious. Instead, what we see are normal geological features, ridges, trenches, volcanic islands, but no grand missing landmass. Historians also like to point out how Atlantis fits neatly into Plato's writing style. He loved crafting examples of ideal states, imaginary models to contrast with real ones. In Republic, he sketches a perfect city ruled by philosopher kings. In Timaeus and Critias, Atlantis serves as the foil, a once great society undone by greed and arrogance, defeated by plucky little Athens. It's almost too convenient, like he built Atlantis solely to make Athens look heroic. And let's be honest, philosophers are not above stacking the deck in their own arguments. But then you cross the aisle, and things get a lot less tidy. Speculation has been the lifeblood of Atlantis for centuries, and once you invite speculation to the party, it never leaves quietly. Writers like Ignatius Donnelly in the 19th century argued that Atlantis was real and responsible for nearly every major human achievement. Pyramids in Egypt, Atlantis, Mayan temples, Atlantis, alphabet, Atlantis. Basically, any impressive stonework or early innovation was chalked up to this convenient lost continent. Never mind that cultures could and did invent things independently, Atlantis made for a catchier explanation. By the 20th century, Atlantis speculation had splintered into dozens of colorful theories. Some argued it was in the Mediterranean, pointing to the volcanic island of Santorini and the Minoan civilization wiped out by eruption and tsunami. Others pushed it into the Atlantic proper, suggesting the Azores Islands were mountaintops of the submerged continent. Still others dragged it further afield, the Caribbean, Antarctica, even under the Sahara Desert. Apparently, Atlantis is like a pop-up shop. It can be located anywhere you'd like, depending on your agenda. And then, of course, came the really speculative turns. Atlantis as a hub of alien contact, Atlantis as a crystal-powered civilization, Atlantis as proof of prehistoric nuclear war. These theories thrive not because they have evidence, but because they don't. The very absence of proof becomes the proof. Of course we can't find it, believers say, because it was deliberately erased or sank so completely the evidence is gone. It's a neat trick. You can't disprove it, but you also can't verify it. Like Schrodinger's island, Atlantis is both everywhere and nowhere. The scientists, understandably, get cranky about this. They argue, patiently, sometimes not so patiently, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and Atlantis hasn't produced a scrap of it. They remind us that geology is quite firm about how continents move, how oceans form, and that entire land masses don't just vanish overnight without leaving a very obvious paper trail in the rocks. They point out that every single supposed Atlantis ruin has turned out to be either natural formations, misidentified sites, or wishful thinking. The infamous Bimini Road in the Bahamas, for example, is almost certainly a natural limestone formation. Beautiful, yes. Proof of a crystal-powered Atlantean superhighway? Sadly, no. But here's the twist. The more the scholars insist Atlantis is fiction, the more some people dig in their heels. Partly because mystery is fun, partly because authority figures saying, "Don't believe that," often has the opposite effect, and partly because Atlantis scratches an itch that pure history doesn't. History gives us facts, pottery shards, trade routes, census lists. Atlantis gives us a myth of lost greatness, a story of human potential cut short. Which would you rather daydream about before bed? Sheep tallies from Uruk or gleaming golden walls swallowed by the sea. The fight between science and speculation has turned Atlantis into more than just a legend. It's become a battleground of imagination. On one side, the cautious voices saying, "This is allegory, not evidence." On the other, the adventurous voices saying, "But what if?" And hovering in the middle is the story itself, refusing to shut up, refusing to fade. Maybe that's the most interesting part. The scholars may be right. Atlantis was likely just Plato's fable. The conspiracy theorists may be wrong. There are no Atlantean UFO hangars in Antarctica. But the persistence of the debate tells us something important. People crave wonder. We crave stories that make us glance at the sea and wonder what lies beneath. Atlantis survives not because it was real, but because we want it to be real, because imagining it satisfies a part of us that raw data never will. So yes, the archaeologists will keep shaking their heads, the theorists will keep spinning new maps, and the rest of us will keep listening, lulled by the thought that somewhere, just maybe, beneath the waves lies a city of gold, a city that proves we were once greater, or could be again, and as much as science insists otherwise, that possibility, the fragile, unlikely, intoxicating what if, isn't going anywhere. Here's the strange thing about Atlantis. It thrives on absence. Most stories fade when evidence runs out. If no one can find Troy or Babylon or Machu Picchu, eventually people lose interest, shrug, and move on. But Atlantis? The less proof there is, the stronger the legend becomes. It's like the Bermuda Triangle of history. Every unanswered question just makes the mystery juicier. Think about it. Plato gave us two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, that describe Atlantis. Not hundreds of texts, not a stack of clay tablets, just two works that, to make matters worse, were never even finished. Critias breaks off mid-sentence, as if Plato got bored, distracted, or just never made it to the part where he explained whether Atlantis had good wine. That's it. That's the entire ancient record. The greatest lost civilization in history, and it lives in about 30 pages of Greek prose. That gap is irresistible. It leaves space. Space for poets, priests, explorers, and conspiracy theorists to fill with whatever they need. Renaissance thinkers looking for a model of utopia, Atlantis. Colonial adventurers trying to justify conquest, Atlantis. New Age mystics selling crystal healing seminars, Atlantis again. The fact that Plato didn't nail down the details, no map coordinates, no census numbers, no recipe for Atlantean stew, meant everyone who came later could pour their own imagination into the void. And isn't that how our minds work? If someone hands you a puzzle with missing pieces, you don't throw it away. You stare harder. You start imagining what the missing parts look like. You invent shapes that might fit. Atlantis is history's longest-running puzzle, and the missing pieces are exactly what keep people engaged. Geography plays into it too. If Plato had said Atlantis was in a specific valley that we've since mapped and confirmed has no ruins, the debate would be over. But instead, he placed it beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. Beyond that, he said, lay an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. That's vague enough to fuel centuries of speculation. Beyond Gibraltar could mean the Atlantic, the Caribbean, even the Americas. Larger than Libya and Asia combined could be literal, symbolic, or just Plato exaggerating for dramatic effect. The fuzziness is the point. It's like dropping a treasure map with half the symbols missing. People can't help but try to complete it, and the cataclysmic ending doesn't hurt either. Atlantis supposedly vanished in a single day and night of misfortune, swallowed by earthquakes and floods. It's dramatic, terrifying, and, crucially, plausible enough to sound like it might have happened. Natural disasters have always reshaped human memory. Whole towns have disappeared in volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, earthquakes. Santorini in the Aegean exploded around 1600 BCE and buried Minoan settlements in ash. Pompeii vanished under Vesuvius. So when Plato describes Atlantis being wiped out by the sea, it doesn't sound completely far-fetched. That shred of plausibility makes the gap more tantalizing. If it could happen, maybe it did happen. The gap also connects Atlantis to a deeper human longing, the idea that something greater once existed, and we've lost it. Every culture has myths of golden ages, paradises, perfect worlds destroyed by arrogance or catastrophe. The Garden of Eden, the Golden Age of Greece, Shambhala in Tibetan lore. Atlantis fits snugly into that pattern. It tells us that once, long ago, humanity was better, more advanced, more powerful, more harmonious, and that we ruined it. The lack of evidence doesn't disprove the myth, it just leaves room for our nostalgia to stretch its legs, and modern media loves a vacuum. From the 19th century onward, every generation has reinvented Atlantis to suit its mood. Explorers in the Age of Empire imagined it as a source of lost wisdom and justification for colonial expansion. Pulp magazines in the early 20th century turned it into a playground of ray guns and submersibles. The New Age movement in the 1970s gave us crystal pyramids and psychic Atlantean energy. Video games and movies today repackage it as a setting for adventure, a brand name for mystery itself. The less we know, the more flexible the myth becomes. The irony, of course, is that the actual absence of evidence becomes part of the story. Believers will say, "Of course we can't find Atlantis. It was destroyed so completely, the sea erased it." Or, "The ruins are hidden under miles of sediment." Or, "The authorities are covering it up." Silence becomes proof. The lack of evidence is not a problem. It's a feature. It allows the myth to keep floating, unanchored, adaptable. And this adaptability makes Atlantis weirdly timeless. Other myths get locked into specific cultures. Zeus belongs to Greece, Odin to Scandinavia, Quetzalcoatl to Mesoamerica. But Atlantis belongs to everyone. It doesn't have a specific language or pantheon. It's just a place, a dream of lost perfection waiting to be claimed. That's why it shows up in everything from Renaissance philosophy to Marvel comics. It's a story big enough, vague enough, and flexible enough to be endlessly recycled. So when people argue about Atlantis, was it real? Was it allegory? Was it aliens? The truth is, the argument itself is the point. The debate keeps the myth alive. If archaeologists ever found Atlantis tomorrow, with inscriptions and ruins neatly matching Plato's description, the mystery would evaporate. It would stop being a dream and start being a dig site. Tourists would buy tickets, cruise ships would visit, someone would open a Starbucks in the ruins, and just like that the spell would be broken. But because we don't know, because we can't know, the story stays alive in a way confirmed history rarely does. It leaves room for imagination, for wonder, for that delicious sense of maybe. Maybe the sea is hiding a city of gold. Maybe our ancestors once had secrets we've forgotten. Maybe paradise isn't gone. It's just sleeping under the waves. So the gap isn't a flaw in the Atlantis story. It's the secret of its survival. Every unanswered question becomes an invitation, every silence a doorway. And for thousands of years, people have walked through that doorway into a world that never stops changing because it never stops being imagined. Here's a paradox that would probably make Plato laugh if he were still around. The very thing that makes Atlantis weak as history is exactly what makes it strong as a story. The lack of evidence. Those missing ruins, those blank maps, those silences in the record has turned Atlantis into something bigger than any city that ever actually existed. If archaeologists dug up Atlantis tomorrow, complete with golden walls and concentric canals, it would stop being a myth and start being a museum exhibit. Interesting, sure, but not haunting. That's the strange power of absence. Compare Atlantis to Troy. For centuries, Troy was also dismissed as legend, a fantasy from Homer's imagination. Then, in the 19th century, Heinrich Schliemann went digging in Turkey and declared he'd found it. Debate followed, but the general point stuck. Troy was real, and once that happened, Troy lost a little of its shine. It became archaeology, layers of burned walls, pottery shards, bronze weapons. Fascinating to scholars, but the mythic glow dimmed. Atlantis has never had that happen. Because it has never been confirmed, it has never been reduced to measurements, artifacts, and excavation reports. Instead, Atlantis floats in the realm of pure imagination. You can picture it however you like. Gleaming temples plated with gold, libraries filled with forgotten knowledge, crystal towers buzzing with alien energy. You can set it anywhere. The Atlantic, the Mediterranean, Antarctica, even another planet. You can people it with whoever you need, philosopher kings, ancient astronauts, or wise mystics with suspiciously modern ideas. Atlantis is a blank slate disguised as a lost city, and because the slate is blank, it can never really be disproven. There's also the fact that Atlantis offers a narrative pattern so irresistible that it doesn't need physical ruins to support it. Rise, hubris, fall. A civilization grows too powerful, becomes too arrogant, and is destroyed in a single cataclysm. That arc is timeless. It's the same shape as countless myths, histories, and cautionary tales. Rome had its decline. The Tower of Babel collapsed. The biblical flood wiped away a corrupt humanity. Atlantis fits right into that rhythm, but with the added bonus that its destruction was total. No survivors, no ruins, no evidence, just a cautionary echo, the perfect story, because it can never be contradicted by messy reality. Think about how most ancient ruins actually look. The Parthenon in Athens is stunning, but it's missing its roof, its paint, half its sculptures. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia today are piles of mud brick, barely recognizable as temples. Even Machu Picchu, one of the most beautiful ruins in the world, requires imagination to see it as the living city it once was. But Atlantis has no ruins. So in the mind's eye, it's always perfect, always gleaming, intact, and alive. Absence lets imagination do the restoration work that reality can't. The lack of evidence also means Atlantis can never go out of style. When one theory is debunked, say that it was the Azores or Santorini, another theory steps in to take its place. It's like a hydra of speculation. Cut off one head and two more grow back. That keeps the story evergreen. Archaeology ages, but mystery renews itself. Atlantis survives not despite being unprovable, but because it's unprovable. There's a deeper psychological angle here too. Humans don't just crave answers, we crave big answers. We want origins, destinies, secrets that explain everything. But reality often gives us small, unsatisfying truths. Civilizations rise and fall mostly due to boring things like drought, trade routes, or poor leadership. Nobody wants to hear that an empire crumbled because the irrigation ditches clogged. Atlantis, by contrast, offers a grand cinematic explanation. The gods punished them, or the earth swallowed them, or they flew too close to perfection and paid the price. That scale of drama scratches an itch that mundane history can't. And when people go looking for meaning in the gaps of history, Atlantis is waiting. In the Renaissance, it became a symbol of utopia. a philosophical playground for imagining better societies. In the 19th century, it became a pseudo-historical justification for ideas about race and progress. Troubling, yes, but powerful to those who wanted a myth to anchor their worldviews. In the 20th century, it merged with science fiction, becoming a story about aliens, lost technologies, and forgotten super science. Each version works not because of evidence, but because of the lack of it. You can drape Atlantis in any costume, and it still fits. The irony is that history's most powerful legends are often the ones with the least evidence. King Arthur, Robin Hood, El Dorado all thrive on uncertainty. They live in the gray zone between what might have been and what probably wasn't. Atlantis sits at the top of that category, the crown jewel of what if. It doesn't matter if Plato invented it as an allegory. It doesn't matter if every scholar on Earth insists it was fiction. The lack of evidence guarantees that the debate never ends, and the debate is what keeps it alive. There's also a comforting angle to Atlantis. If it was real, it means there was once a civilization greater than ours, lost but not gone. It means the world might still hold secrets, knowledge waiting to be rediscovered. In a way, believing in Atlantis is less about the past than about the future. It's a promise that maybe we haven't peaked yet, that there's wisdom buried under the waves that could guide us if we just find it. The lack of ruins doesn't kill that hope, it feeds it. So why is the absence of evidence more powerful than evidence itself? Because evidence closes doors, absence leaves them wide open. If archaeologists one day definitively proved that Atlantis was just a story, no ruins, no island, nothing but Plato's imagination, some people would move on, but others would keep the dream alive anyway, because that's what absence does. It lets you project, dream, and imagine without limits. Atlantis, then, is less a place and more a canvas. A story you can't disprove, a mystery you can't solve, a lesson you can never fully pin down. And maybe that's why it lingers in our imaginations more powerfully than the ruins of Ur or the pyramids of Giza. Those are history. Atlantis is possibility, and possibility, even unproven, can be more compelling than the truth. So as you drift deeper into this story tonight, think of Atlantis not as a city we lost, but as a story we keep rewriting. Its power comes not from stones or inscriptions, but from the silence in between. And in that silence, the imagination never sleeps. Chapter 4. Atlantis in Our Dreams and Fears. When you peel back the layers of the Atlantis story, what you're really left with isn't an island or a sunken city. It's a mirror, a big, shimmering, slightly distorted mirror reflecting humanity's own obsessions, anxieties, and desires. Atlantis works so well not because it tells us much about a place that may or may not have existed, but because it tells us so much about ourselves. Plato, the original teller of the tale, wasn't interested in lost continents or sunken ruins. He was interested in people, their strengths, their flaws, their governments, their ambitions. Atlantis was a metaphor wrapped in marble columns and golden temples. It was a way to ask questions about what happens when a society has everything: fertile fields, precious metals, advanced laws, a culture of abundance. Do they live wisely and justly, or do they become arrogant, corrupt, and doomed? Spoiler: Plato leaned toward option 2, and so Atlantis fell. That basic narrative, utopia spoiled by hubris, resonates because it feels familiar. We've seen it again and again in history and in myth. The Tower of Babel, Rome's decline, the biblical flood, the fall of countless empires, great and small. Atlantis is just another version of the same warning, that greatness contains the seeds of its own destruction. It's not really about an island, it's about us. And that's why Atlantis has survived for millennia, long after countless other Greek myths faded away, because the story is flexible enough to fit whatever anxieties we're currently nursing. In times of prosperity, it warns us not to get too comfortable. In times of crisis, it tells us that collapse is part of the cycle, that civilizations rise and fall like waves on the sea. In times of exploration, it promises that there are still hidden places waiting to be found. Atlantis becomes whatever reflection we need. Take the Renaissance, for example. Europe was rediscovering ancient texts, experimenting with new forms of government, and sketching wild maps of unexplored worlds. Suddenly, Atlantis wasn't just a lost city. It was a model of utopia, a perfect society that could inspire reform. Philosophers used it to dream about justice, equality, and order. Atlantis mirrored the hope of building something better than the chaos around them. Fast forward to the age of exploration. Sailors crossed oceans, stumbled on new continents, and returned with tales of strange lands and strange peoples. Atlantis became a convenient explanation for any mystery. Unfamiliar ruins must be Atlantis, new islands, perhaps remnants of the lost continent. It reflected both the excitement of discovery and the fear of the unknown. The story became a way of processing the sheer scale of the world. Then, in the modern era, Atlantis took another turn. With the rise of science fiction and conspiracy theories, it became a mirror of technological anxiety. Maybe Atlantis wasn't destroyed by the gods. It was destroyed by its own advanced machines, weapons, or experiments gone wrong. Maybe they harnessed energy from crystals, dabbled in powers they couldn't control, or pushed science too far. Sound familiar? That's the nuclear age peering back at itself in the mirror. Atlantis became a parable not just of arrogance, but of technology running ahead of wisdom. And that's the enduring trick of Atlantis. It's never really about the past. It's always about the present. Whatever worries are keeping people awake at night, Atlantis reshapes itself to reflect them. Economic collapse. Atlantis reminds us civilizations can vanish overnight. Climate change. Atlantis whispers that rising seas can drown even the greatest empires. Political corruption. Atlantis is the story of leaders who had everything and squandered it. Spiritual longing. Atlantis becomes a paradise lost, proof that perfection once existed and might return again. There's also the deeper, more personal reflection. Atlantis isn't just about nations, it's about individuals. Who among us hasn't felt like we're building our own little utopia only to watch it crumble? A job lost, a relationship ruined, a plan that collapsed in spectacular fashion. Atlantis feels personal because it's about fragility, about how easily something we thought permanent can slip away. You don't need to be a king on a golden throne to know what it feels like when the ground shakes and the walls tumble, and maybe that's why the story is so sticky. It reassures us that collapse isn't just personal failure, it's part of the human condition. Everyone, everywhere, eventually faces their own Atlantis moment. The island sinks, the dream disappears, the perfect plan falls apart. But out of that collapse comes reflection, storytelling, and sometimes even renewal. Plato's myth has also worked for so long because it flatters us while it warns us. On the one hand, Atlantis was a magnificent place, full of wealth, beauty, and brilliance. To imagine Atlantis is to imagine humanity at its most dazzling. On the other hand, Atlantis was arrogant, greedy, and reckless. To imagine its destruction is to acknowledge our own flaws. It's both compliment and insult at once, which is exactly why it keeps our attention. Who doesn't like a story that says, you are capable of greatness, but don't mess it up? So, When we talk about Atlantis, we're not really talking about a city beneath the waves. We're talking about the reflection we see in its watery surface. The story doesn't just survive because it's mysterious. It survives because it's useful. It lets us talk about ourselves without pointing the finger too directly. Plato invented a stage, stocked it with gleaming temples and concentric canals, and then let us project our own anxieties onto it. Every age since has done the same. And here's the final irony. The more we study Atlantis, the less we learn about it, but the more we learn about ourselves. Scholars trace the myth to Plato's philosophy. Conspiracy theorists link it to aliens. Novelists turn it into utopia. Filmmakers make it an adventure. None of those versions reveal what Atlantis really was, but each one reveals what that storyteller feared or hoped for in their own time. Atlantis is history's best Rorschach test, a blot of ink shaped like a sunken island, inviting us to see whatever we want. So as you picture Atlantis tonight, don't think of it as a mystery waiting to be solved. Think of it as a mirror waiting to be gazed into. The golden walls, the drowned temples, the sudden cataclysm, they're all props on a stage that's really about us. And the reflection you see in that stage might not be flattering, but it will always be true. If Atlantis is a mirror, then it's one that shows us two very different faces at once. On one side, it's utopia, gleaming temples plated in gold, wide canals irrigating fertile plains, a society that seemed to have cracked the code of abundance. On the other side, it's a warning, a place that collapsed under its own arrogance, dragged into the sea not by chance but by its own corruption. Atlantis is both dream and nightmare, a bedtime story and a cautionary tale rolled into one. Plato painted the picture carefully. The Atlanteans were the children of Poseidon, gods mixed with mortals, destined to build something extraordinary. Their island had everything: mountains filled with ore, plains bursting with grain, forests for timber, and harbors deep enough to welcome fleets of ships. The city itself was a marvel, laid out in concentric circles of land and sea, its walls plated in precious metals, its temples glowing in the sun. If you squint, it sounds like a real estate brochure for paradise. Come live where the soil is rich, the climate is gentle, and the gods themselves signed off on the architecture. But here's the twist. For all their advantages, the Atlanteans were still human, or at least half human, and that meant the cracks began to show. Virtue slipped into vanity. Order gave way to excess. The same abundance that once symbolized harmony became an excuse for indulgence. Plato describes their decline not as a dramatic villain's turn, but as a slow erosion of character. Wealth replaced wisdom. Power replaced justice. Eventually they weren't noble rulers anymore. They were conquerors, marching across the seas, bullying other nations, picking fights they didn't need to pick. And if that sounds familiar, it should. It's the same story told about countless empires, Rome, Britain, maybe even some in our own lifetimes. When resources are plenty, societies imagine they've been blessed by destiny itself. But plenty often breeds complacency, and complacency leads to overreach. Atlantis becomes the mythic shorthand for what happens when you start believing your own press releases. Plato, being Plato, wasn't just telling a story about a lost island. He was telling his students, maybe even us, that utopia doesn't last. The moment you stop practicing virtue, the moment you start treating power as entitlement, you've already set your society's expiration date. Atlantis is the ultimate don't get cocky kid lecture, dressed up in gold and seawater. This dual identity, paradise and punishment, is what keeps Atlantis fascinating. If it were just a utopia, we'd dismiss it as a boring fantasy. If it were just a disaster story, it would blend in with the thousands of other flood myths, but together they form a kind of narrative seesaw. The higher the city rises, the harder it falls. That swing between awe and catastrophe is what makes Atlantis so sticky. It promises everything and then rips it away. Think about how the story lands at bedtime. On one level, it's comforting. Atlantis was a place where abundance was possible, where order and justice once thrived. On another, it's unsettling. No matter how perfect things look, they can sink in a single night. It's like hearing a lullaby with a warning tucked inside. Sweet dreams, but don't get too comfortable. And perhaps that's why Atlantis continues to resonate today. We live in a world where abundance and collapse sit side by side. On one hand, we have technologies, resources, and comforts that would make ancient kings jealous. On the other, we face climate change, political instability, and anxieties about how long it all can last. Atlantis whispers to us, paradise can be real, but it's fragile, and if you take it for granted, it won't survive. Utopia and warning also play out in how the story has been adapted. Philosophers of the Renaissance looked to Atlantis as a model for the perfect society. They wanted the irrigation canals, the orderly laws, the shining temples. They ignored, conveniently, the part where it all falls apart. On the flip side, modern storytellers, from environmentalists to science fiction writers, have leaned heavily into the warning side. Atlantis becomes the ultimate example of climate catastrophe, unchecked ambition, or technology gone wrong. Each age picks the face of Atlantis it needs most. But if you step back, the genius of the myth is that it doesn't let you choose. Atlantis is both. You can't admire its beauty without remembering its collapse. You can't mourn its destruction without acknowledging that it was self-inflicted. The myth insists on pairing dream with downfall, reminding us that the line between the two is razor thin. So next time you imagine Atlantis, picture it in both states at once. Picture the gleaming city, concentric rings shining in the sun, bustling harbors filled with ships, and picture too the waves rising, the ground shaking, the temples slipping into the sea. Utopia and warning, side by side, inseparable. That's the rhythm of the story, and that's why it still lingers after thousands of years. In the end, Atlantis doesn't just ask us to marvel at what might have been. It asks us to look around at what we have now, to wonder whether we're tending our garden or already digging our own watery grave. Utopia is fragile, the myth reminds us, and the warning never expires. If there's one thing you can say about Atlantis, it's that it refuses to stay underwater. Every generation seems determined to drag it back up, polish it off, and give it a fresh coat of meaning. In fact, you could argue that Atlantis has had more comebacks than your favorite pop star. From dusty philosophy texts to blockbuster movies, it has been remixed, rebranded, and resold as everything from paradise to alien spaceport. And somehow it always works. Atlantis is like the original viral content. It just won't quit. The first big revival came in the Renaissance, when European thinkers rediscovered Plato. They didn't just read about Atlantis. They latched onto it like a blueprint. Imagine you're a 16th century scholar surrounded by plague, poor sanitation, and a monarchy that thinks bathing once a year is excessive. Then you stumble across this description of a perfectly organized, resource-rich society blessed by gods. Of course you're going to think, yes please, I'll have one of those. Atlantis became the template for utopias, inspiring thinkers like Francis Bacon, who spun it into his vision of an ideal society in New Atlantis. Notice, though, that Bacon conveniently skipped over the part where the city collapses in a single night. Human optimism has always been selective. Then came the Romantics in the 18th and 19th centuries. For them, Atlantis wasn't just philosophy, it was poetry. It became a symbol of lost innocence, of a paradise gone forever. Painters imagined dreamy seascapes with ruins beneath the waves, while poets sighed over forgotten golden ages. Atlantis wasn't just a city, it was nostalgia made myth, a longing for something that never quite existed but felt emotionally true. This version still lingers today, in every wistful sigh about lost civilizations and ancient wisdom. By the 20th century, Atlantis took a hard left turn. Enter the occultists and mystics. Madame Blavatsky and her Theosophical Society claimed Atlantis was the home of spiritually advanced beings who tinkered with crystals, psychic powers, and mysterious energies. Suddenly, Atlantis wasn't just a ruined city, it was the cradle of hidden knowledge, a cosmic library where secrets of the universe were stashed. You can almost hear the crystal shops ringing up sales. This mystical Atlantis bled straight into New Age thought, where it still glimmers today in books, retreats, and more than a few questionable YouTube channels. And then came Hollywood. If Plato gave Atlantis its birth certificate, Disney gave it a driver's license. Films like Atlantis, The Lost Empire turned the myth into adventure fodder. Submarines, magical crystals, dashing explorers. Atlantis has also popped up in superhero comics, fantasy epics, and even animated sitcoms. One minute it's a futuristic utopia, the next it's a dark, menacing realm filled with sea-worn ruins. Atlantis has range, and pop culture loves a flexible myth. It can be paradise, prison, or playground, depending on the plot. Of course, we can't forget the conspiracy crowd. The History Channel's Ancient Aliens practically made Atlantis a recurring character, treating it as everything from an alien landing strip to an interdimensional portal. Never mind that Plato never once mentioned UFOs. The lack of details in the original story makes it easy to fill the gaps with whatever you like. And let's be honest, aliens sell better than clay tablets. Atlantis has become the blank canvas where modern anxieties and obsessions get painted in neon colors. What's striking is how Atlantis adapts. In every era, it morphs to fit whatever people want to see. To philosophers, it was a moral fable. To utopians, it was a model. To poets, it was longing. To mystics, it was hidden wisdom. To Hollywood, it was box office gold. To conspiracy theorists, it's proof that they're hiding the truth. Atlantis is like the little black dress of mythology. It never goes out of style because it can be tailored to anything, and this adaptability keeps it alive. Think of other ancient myths. How many people casually talk about the city of Uruk, or the Code of Hammurabi, or even Gilgamesh? All of those are just as old, just as fascinating, but they don't have the same cultural grip. Atlantis, with its simplicity, rich city, sudden doom, fits perfectly into the human imagination. It's a story you can tell in 2 sentences, but it expands endlessly into novels, movies, and debates. There's also the aesthetic pull. Sunken cities just look cool. From paintings of ruins half buried in sand to video games where divers swim through glowing temples, Atlantis is endlessly visual. You don't need to know the philosophy to get hooked. You just need to see a picture of marble columns swaying in blue water. It sparks curiosity instantly, even before the story starts. So here we are, thousands of years after Plato scribbled down his dialogues, still telling, retelling, and reinventing the story. Atlantis has become less of a myth and more of a brand, and like any good brand, it survives because it knows how to reinvent itself for new markets. Whether it's philosophical treatises, romantic poetry, mystical manuals, or CGI adventures, Atlantis delivers what people want most, the promise of something extraordinary just out of reach. And maybe that's the secret. Atlantis is always just out of reach. We never quite pin it down, never quite prove it, never quite agree on what it meant. That ambiguity is the engine of its longevity. As long as people keep dreaming of paradise, fearing collapse, or just craving a good mystery, Atlantis will keep bobbing back to the surface, ready for its next reinvention. Let's be clear, Atlantis has no business still being this famous. It's basically a 2-chapter footnote in Plato, a story he may have invented to make a point about morality and politics. By rights, it should sit quietly on the shelf with all the other ancient cautionary tales no one remembers. But here we are, more than 2,000 years later, still obsessing over it, still debating it, still turning it into video games, Netflix specials, and questionable travel documentaries filmed in murky water. So why can't we let Atlantis go? The answer, I think, is that Atlantis isn't really about Atlantis, it's about us. It's a mirror we keep holding up, generation after generation, to see what kind of anxieties and fantasies are staring back. And if you tilt the mirror just right, it shows you exactly what you're most worried about in your own time. That's why the story keeps working. It adapts to whatever we need it to be. Think about it. In Plato's day, Atlantis was a morality tale about arrogance and overreach. The Atlanteans had it all: wealth, power, divine favor, and they blew it by becoming greedy and corrupt. Sound familiar? It's basically the first rise and fall of empire narrative, something human history has had on repeat ever since. Every time a civilization gets too comfortable, too rich, too sure of itself, people start whispering that they're turning into Atlantis. The Romans thought about it. So did Europeans at the height of their colonial empires. And you could argue we still think about it today, in a quieter, anxious kind of way. The idea of a powerful society crumbling overnight scratches at something deep in us. The fear that progress is fragile, that the world we've built could vanish in a heartbeat. Then there's the utopian angle. Atlantis isn't just a warning, it's also a dream. Plato described it as fertile, resource-rich, and beautifully organized. And let's be honest, part of us wants that world to have existed. A paradise of canals, temples, and gleaming walls. That's catnip for anyone tired of potholes, bureaucracy, and the general chaos of modern life. The allure of Atlantis is that it dangles the possibility of a better civilization, one that's smarter, cleaner, more advanced. Of course, it doesn't end well, but the dream sticks. Every time society feels messy or unstable, Atlantis whispers that maybe once we had it figured out. There's also something irresistible about the mystery factor. Humans hate not knowing things. Show us a blank space on a map and we'll invent monsters to fill it. Leave gaps in a myth and we'll cram them with whatever theories we can dream up. Atlantis is basically a giant unsolved puzzle, and people love puzzles. Was it real? If so, where was it? Santorini, Spain, the Caribbean, Antarctica under the ice? Everyone has a favorite guess, and none of them are provable. That endless guessing game is addictive. It keeps the conversation alive because the answer never comes. But the biggest reason we can't let go might be more personal. Atlantis taps into the oldest human emotions, loss and longing. The idea of a paradise destroyed in a single night, gone forever beneath the waves, hits a nerve. It's the ultimate, you don't know what you've got until it's gone story. We project onto it all our own experiences of loss, lost loves, lost childhoods, lost dreams. Atlantis becomes a symbol of everything we wish we could get back but can't. That's a pretty powerful hook for a myth that started as a thought experiment. And let's not forget the delicious little thrill of catastrophe. There's something perversely satisfying about imagining it all going wrong. An empire wiped out by earthquakes, floods, and divine punishment. It's the same itch disaster movies scratch. The reminder that even the biggest, strongest, most advanced societies are fragile, that our comforts aren't guaranteed, that the ocean, the earth, the sky, they don't care how high we build our walls. Atlantis lets us play out that fear safely as a story while we sit snug in our beds with the Wi-Fi humming. So Atlantis endures because it sits at the crossroads of all these impulses, our fear of collapse, our longing for paradise, our love of mysteries, and our fascination with disasters. It's not just a story, it's a psychological toolkit. We use it to think about ourselves, to worry about the future, and to dream about what might have been. And maybe that's the secret ingredient. Atlantis doesn't have an ending. Sure, Plato says it sank, but in a way, the story never sank with it. Every generation digs it up again, dusts it off, and turns it into something new. Atlantis is immortal not because it was real, but because it was never pinned down. You can't fact-check it into oblivion. You can't ruin it with spoilers. It's the perfect open-ended myth, forever floating just below the surface of imagination. So when you hear someone talking about Atlantis, whether it's in a scholarly lecture or a late-night internet rant, what you're really hearing is humanity talking to itself, asking the same questions we've always asked. Can civilizations last? What does paradise look like? How fragile is everything we've built? And maybe, just maybe, is there a chance that somewhere out there, under waves or ice or stars, something extraordinary is still waiting to be found? That's why we can't let go. Not because we believe in Plato's exact coordinates or because we've spotted suspicious rock formations on Google Earth, but because Atlantis is less about the past and more about the questions that haunt us now. And those questions never sink. So here we are, at the end of our long meandering walk through the legend of Atlantis. We've followed it from the careful lines of Plato's dialogues, through the shimmering descriptions of canals and golden temples, into the chaos of cataclysm, and finally out into the modern fog of speculation and pop culture. And now, as the story winds down, it feels right to ask, what was all of this really about? Was it a history lesson, a morality play, a bedtime story? Or maybe, like most things that endure for thousands of years, it was all of those at once. Atlantis, after all, was never just a place. It was always an idea, a stage for us to act out our biggest hopes and fears. Plato used it to talk about the dangers of arrogance and the fragility of empires. Later thinkers used it to imagine perfect societies, or to mourn lost ones. Modern dreamers have turned it into a puzzle to solve, a mystery to chase, even a conspiracy to argue over on internet forums at 3 a.m. The actual island may never have existed, but the idea has been more solid than stone. And maybe that's why Atlantis fits so neatly into this kind of video, this kind of story designed to help you drift towards sleep, because Atlantis itself is halfway between worlds, half myth, half history, half warning, half dream. It doesn't need to be proven to feel real. It doesn't need coordinates on a map to matter. Like a dream, it exists in that hazy place where logic blurs and imagination takes over. And in that space, Atlantis is as alive tonight as it was 2,000 years ago. There's a kind of comfort in that. The Mesopotamians told flood myths, the Egyptians told stories of eternal kingdoms, and Plato told the story of Atlantis. All of them were trying to do the same thing, make sense of a world that never quite sits still. Floods come, empires fall, cities vanish. It's unnerving, but it's also universal. The Atlantis story reminds us that even the ancients worried about collapse, about losing everything overnight. We may feel uniquely fragile today, but the truth is, people have always felt that way. The story of Atlantis is proof, and yet there's also hope tucked into the myth. If Atlantis is a warning, it's also a dream of possibility, a dream that somewhere, sometime, there might have been a society more advanced, more beautiful, more just. A dream that we might one day build something like it again, only without the hubris that dragged it into the sea. Atlantis reminds us that imagining better worlds is as important as warning against bad ones. And if nothing else, it keeps us asking questions. What should a good society look like? How do we avoid our own collapse? How do we balance ambition with humility? But tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you don't need to carry all those heavy questions with you. You don't need to decide whether Atlantis was a real island or just a philosopher's allegory. You don't need to solve the puzzle of Santorini or scour maps of the Atlantic sea floor. You can let the questions settle like silt drifting to the bottom of the ocean, quiet and undisturbed, because the story has already done its work. It has given you something to wonder about, something to ease you out of the noise of today and into the softer rhythm of history and imagination. So take a moment, picture that concentric city one last time, the gleaming walls, the bridges arched over canals, the temples shining in the sun. Picture the ships in their harbors, the fields watered by ingenious channels, the markets full of chatter and trade. Picture the people living their lives, proud and busy, never imagining that one day their entire world would vanish. And then picture the waves closing in, the sea swallowing the stone, the lights flickering out, not as tragedy, not as disaster, but as part of the endless rhythm of time, rise and fall, dawn and dusk, waking and sleeping. And here's the gentle truth. You don't need to worry about any of that right now. The seas outside your window aren't rising to sweep you away. The ground beneath you isn't shaking with earthquakes. The gods aren't about to punish you for arrogance or ambition. Tonight, you are safe, you are warm, and the only collapse you need to look forward to is the slow, welcome collapse into sleep. So let Atlantis fade, the way it always does, into the dark. Let it sink beneath the waves of thought, leaving only a quiet ripple in your mind. Let the voices of philosophers and dreamers fade into whispers like distant surf. And let yourself drift gently into the kind of sleep that carries you into your own dreams. Dreams where lost cities, golden temples, and endless oceans wait for you. Not as history or warning, but simply as places to wander until morning comes. Good night.